course, you know a thing or two about addiction. About 40 years ago, you had a life changing situation come about. What happened, and what did you do to change your life?
Well, Joe, it's when I ruptured my Achilles tendon, I drank when I pitched. I was on a 5 day man rotation, and when I started that, I was never ever going to uh, uh, go out to the mound and be under the influence of any kind of alcohol like that. And that's what I did. And for many years, I pitched, and after I'd pitch, I'd go out and I'd have a few beers or a few drinks, and then maybe the next night, and then I taper off, and then the night before I would not have anything, and then get ready for my game the next day or the next night when I was pitching. And as time went on, uh, I found myself drinking more, and but I was still having success. And when you're, when I was having success like that, you think that you're sort of invincible or something. Nothing's going
Hmm.
to happen. Nothing's going to happen serious to you, and you go from there. And I can honestly tell you, and I've told this before many times. I've shared this. That in 1965, the day I pitched that no hitter in Chicago, the night before, I was going back to the hotel, and I said I was going to after I was going to go up, because in those days we played all day games, and Chicago had no lights. I mean, they were all day games, and so anyway, I went back, going back to the hotel, and I said, well, I go to this little place that was a place around the corner called the Inkwell, and guys used to hang out in there and go down in there, and had a bartender that would he had magic tricks, and he'd do stuff with the mixing drinks, and he was like a one man show behind there, and so I went down there and I started, and I started, one drink led to another, and I'm pitching the next day, and it got to be about 2 o'clock in the morning, and they shut her down, and I was just terrible. I mean, I staggered back to the hotel. I got back up in the room, and I thought to myself, man, I said I never was ever going to do this. And 6 o'clock in the morning, I heard this boom, like a real, and it shook the whole hotel. And I'm thinking, well, what in the world was that? My roommate was John Edwards, my catcher, and
Right.
he said, I think it was thunder. So we opened up the blinds. I looked outside, and it was pouring down rain. And about that time, the phone rang, and it was a traveling secretary, and he said, they've already called the game. So I don't know. Maybe it was higher power or whatever you want to call it. I slept in that day, and that night I had a steak dinner and went back to bed early the next night. And the next day was that day I pitched that no hitter in Chicago.
Wow.
So that's where I was getting in. So when that Achilles tendon thing hit in 1970 and 71, I found myself out of a job and going back to Fresno. And I was going to take over my dad's car business and live happily ever after. I had a family, and my wife was pregnant at that time. My ex-wife was pregnant at that time with my son. I had two daughters prior to that, and I got back into Fresno, and I had a real hard time uh, getting back into the real world. You know what I mean, Joe? I mean, I had a hard time
Hmm.
getting back into the. There was no more uh, fans yelling and screaming in the stands, and I was out of that circle of being good at what I did as my job, and I was making good money. And in those days, I mean, there were no $1 million contracts, but I was making decent money. And I had so my drinking progressed, and I went down the tubes. I mean, I went down the tubes because of my alcoholism. And in 1985, and this was 1972, and no, in 1980, I figured I'd get back into baseball, which I did. And I got a job with the San Francisco Giants, and they in Fresno had a Class A team. They wanted me to be the pitching coach there to start there, and I said, okay, fine. I did that, and I was drinking. And the next year, they made me the manager, and in 1981, I believe it was, and I'd show up to the ballpark, and I'd be half smashed out, and I'm trying to teach kids how to get to the next level. And it was really a sad situation, Joe. And the fans, I'd go out to the third base line and I'd have dry heaves. And fans, it's a small ballpark. They were sitting right there. They probably could see me,
Mm.
you know, that kind of deal. And when I went to the winter meetings with the Giants, they fired me. So I lost. They never said anything about my drinking, but that's was the problem. And so I lost a job. And usually, when somebody loses their job because of drinking, they sort of gets their attention, and it didn't get my attention at all. For the next 4 years, everything got worse, and my wife asked me to leave the house, and I bunked up with a guy that I hunted and fished with. It was a single man. He gave, and it was in his place, uh, and I would sit there during the day while he was gone and drinking, and just looking out the window, and kids were walking down the street going to school. I was right across from Fresno State College football stadium, and that's where I ended up, Joe. That's where Jim Maloney ended up, and I got a phone call. I got a phone call from the guy that I lockered next to in Cincinnati, a guy named Jim Merritt. He was a left-handed pitcher for Minnesota. Then he got traded to us in the late '60s, and he did a real good job. In 1970, won 20 ball games for us, and
Mm.
so anyway, he would carry a bottle around with him, and I always said to myself, I'm never going to be like this guy. This guy really was sick, and
Yeah.
drinking all the time during the day, and everything that was obvious. And I get a phone call, and it was Jim Barrett, and he told me that he'd been sober for 6 years, and I didn't believe him. I didn't believe him, and he was down in L.A. and they'd heard that Jim Maloney was out, on his ear, and alcohol was, I was having problems with alcohol in my life, and he says, he says I can give you a number to call, and he says you can talk to this fellow and you can get some help if you want to do something about your drinking. And so anyway, he gave me a number, and I called this number, and it was a guy named John Newton. He was the medical director of Unocal 76, which is a big gas company here, oil and gas company in California, and they sponsor all the Dodger games. They still do. And he was sitting there, and he was the medical director, and he says, "Hey, there's a guy sitting here at my desk right now. He wants to talk to you." And I said, "Who in the world would that be?" So he put him on the phone, and he says, "Hey, you stupid idiot." He didn't say that. He sort of cussed me out.
Yeah.
And what are you doing? Trying to kill yourself? He says, "Why don't you?" He says, "We got a spot here you can go to and get some help." And you know what I said? This is how cunning, baffling, and powerful this disease is. I said, "Let me have a week to think about it."
Uh-huh.
And that's how, that's about how much denial I was in about where I was at that particular time of my life. But anyway, it was Don Newcomb,
Oh,
and Don
yeah.
Newcomb, yeah, and Don Newcomb was sort of working as the EAP guy for the Dodgers, and he was working with guys that had problems drinking, and he did a lot of stuff to help. There were several players, Maury Wills. There were several players. Bob Welsh, who was a pitcher.
Yeah.
And anyway, that's what Newcomb did, and he did it for till he passed away. Maybe he passed away about a year ago, I think it was 90 some years old. But Nuke was like 30 years sober, I think, or maybe more than that at the time. But he lockered next to me in Cincinnati with the first year that I signed in 1959, at the end of his career, and I saw him being dragged to get on the plane. He was so drunk because he was scared to fly, and how bad he had a drinking problem at that time. And he had gotten help and he had this job with the Dodgers. So anyway, they said to call this number, and I called this number, and it was a treatment program over in Wickenburg, Arizona, called the Meadows. And I did a lot of good things. I made a lot of good pitches in my career, a lot of good choices, pitching, making the right pitch. But the best choice of my life that day, I threw in the towel I got on a plane. I went to Wickenburg, Arizona. That was February the 5th of 1985, and I haven't had a drink since that day. And God willing, I'm only worried about today, but God willing, this February the 5th, it'll be 40 years. So it,
Wow.
I just live in today, one day at a time. Today is the only day that matters for me.
Yeah, that's beautiful, beautiful story, Jim.